Question number 6, Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. When he says, quote, "I'm ruling out New Zealand sending SAS or any troops into combat roles in Iraq," end quote, for how long can New Zealanders rely on him sticking to this guarantee?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, yesterday I ruled out sending SAS or any troops into combat roles in Iraq, and I do not see that changing.
Mr Speaker, supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Will this guarantee be more permanent than his last guarantee when he previously ruled out the SAS going to Iraq in any capacity on the 16th of June of this year, only to reverse that position on the 20th of October after the election, saying that the SAS going there was definitely an option?
He tells lies.
Order. Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, the Cabinet determined on Monday of this week a decision which was that we would engage in the fight against ISIS on 4 aspects: diplomacy, intelligence, humanitarian aid and capacity building for Iraqi forces if requested by the Iraqi government.
Question, Mr Speaker.
Question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
When on the 16th of June this year he ruled out New Zealand Special Force soldiers being deployed to Iraq, even, in his words, in an advisory capacity, does he stand by that promise, or is that promise already past its used by date?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, there are no SAS troops planned for deployment in Iraq.
Interesting. We'll hold you to that.
Question, Honourable Phil Goff.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. When he said yesterday that New Zealand military personnel deployed in Iraq would be, quote unquote, behind the wire and limited to training local forces, didn't he previously use exactly those words about New Zealand troops in Afghanistan when we know that the training and mentoring role of the SAS actually involved combat roles in which 2 Special Force soldiers were killed in action?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee, on behalf of the Prime
Mr
Minister.
Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, there are 2 very distinct situations here that are not alike. In Afghanistan, our troops were involved in advise, assist and accompany. We are not intending that they will be involved in any of those aspects in Iraq.
Supplementary
question,
question,
Mr
the Honourable
Speaker.
Phil Goff.
Prior to the Cabinet decision on Monday, did the government send any New Zealand Defence Force personnel or members of the SAS to the Middle East in relation to the campaign against ISIS in any capacity? If so, when and in what capacity?
Mr Speaker,
Honourable Jerry Brownlee,
on behalf of the Prime Minister, the New Zealand Defence Force is engaged at a number of posts in the Middle East, as the member well knows, and have been for many, many years. We have, for example, been for, I think, 34 years involved in peacekeeping in the Sinai. Mr Speaker, the real point here is that some of those personnel will be likely involved in the exploratory work that the military have now been asked to do. They were in that area beforehand, but they were not authorised to do that beforehand.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Why does he imagine that a small group of New Zealand Defence Force trainers will make any difference to the quality of the Iraq Army when more than 10 years of intense efforts on a massive scale by the United States in training that army failed to produce anything like a quality army?
Honourable
Speaker,
Jerry Brownlee, on behalf of the Prime Minister.
On behalf of the Prime Minister, no decision has been made about the capacity building exercise that we may consider. That is why we have personnel there at the moment looking into what may be done. We're setting our own conditions around that, and when we get all of that, we'll be able to make that decision.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Phil Gold.
My question was very carefully worded, and you'll note that the government has said that sending trainers there is an option. My question was not about whether they'd made the decision, but why he would imagine making that decision would make any difference. That's quite precise. It wasn't answered at all.
The Honourable Minister wants to further his answer.
Speaking of the point of order as Leader of the House, the Prime Minister doesn't go around doing things based on imagination. He does it on clear facts, and that's what he's asked the group to go and find for him.
Question number...
Supplementary question.
Supplementary
Yes,
question.
yes.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Can the Prime Minister confirm that members of the SAS are in Iraq now and have been for some time? Yes or no?
Speaker,
Honourable Jerry Brownie on behalf of the Prime Minister.
on behalf of the Prime Minister, that is not my information.
Question number 7, Brett Hudson.